Have you ever had to make one of those really big life choices?
Hmm.
The kind where you just know the outcome is going to shape your future, maybe even someone else's, like choosing a career perhaps, or a big move. Well, imagine that kind of decision, but it's for your child at a really crucial moment, high stakes, and a pretty complex system driving it all.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really digging into the fascinating and often complex world of secondary school choice in Trinidad and Tobago. Our mission to unpack this incredible mixed method study. I mean, it looked at hundreds of thousands of student decisions over a decade. Plus, it includes these really personal interviews with parents and kids. We're going to explore the history, how it actually works day to day, and the sometimes surprising impacts it has on families and, well, society. Now, look, even if you're not in Trinidad and Tobago, this really is a universal story. It's about access, opportunity, the human side of these big systems. It gives some unique insights, I think, into the trade-offs, the unintended consequences of education reforms you see all over the world.
The title of our main source actually says it all. We're diving into a system where choosing might mean losing. That's a pretty bold statement. I'm really keen to find out what makes this system tick.
Yeah, it's fascinating because we're looking at a system that, okay, it's unique in its details, but it touches on these themes you find everywhere in education. Quality, equity, the family's role. It's all in there. And it brings up a really important question, I think. What happens when, a fundamental right, something actually in a constitution, bumps up against the realities of a competitive education market?
And it really is framed as a fundamental right, isn't it? The roots of this whole system in Trinidad and Tobago, they go way back, like 18th century. There was this conflict between the church and the state over schooling. And this idea, this right for parents to choose schools for their kids, it became so ingrained that, well, now it's actually written into the country's Republican Constitution.
Yeah, that historical piece is absolutely critical. It's not just policy, it's a constitutional principle. And the way this right actually works, how it's put into practice, is through this high-stakes exam called the 11 Plus. Kids take it when they're leaving primary school. Parents list their preferred schools beforehand. And then where the child gets placed, well, it largely depends on their score. Higher score, better chance of getting a top choice. And if they don't get any of their listed choices, then the Ministry of Education steps in and assigns them the school.
Okay, so you've got the right, and then you've got the mechanism, the 11 plus exam. How has that mechanism itself changed over the years? And was there pushback?
Well, yeah, the number of choices parents could list actually changed. Between 95 and 2000, it was 4 choices.
Yeah.
Then from 2001 to 2005, it went up to 6. And interestingly, the Ministry of Education, the MOE, they actually tried to regulate these choices sometimes. But those attempts, they always face really strong opposition from, parents, schools, stakeholders. It just shows how deeply people feel about this right to choose.
That makes total sense. And what about the different types of schools? You mentioned church and state history. How do denominational schools fit into this public system?
Right, that's an important point. So the state funds both government schools and these denominational schools. They're all part of the public sector.
Yeah.
But the denominational schools, they do have a bit more autonomy. They have the freedom to select up to 20% of their incoming students themselves. The condition is that the student has to meet a certain minimum score, a benchmark. So that adds, another little wrinkle to the choice process. Slightly different way in for some kids.
Okay, this is super interesting locally, but is this idea of school choice really just a Trinidad and Tobago thing, or is it part of a bigger global trend?
Oh, definitely not unique. Parental school choice is a major education reform strategy, internationally. It's often bundled with other market reforms in education. Things like more school autonomy, funding following the student, more accountability. And the theory behind it sounds pretty good, right? It's supposed to give disadvantaged families more opportunities to access better schools. And schools themselves are supposed to be incentivized to, improve their product to attract students.
Yeah, the theory sounds great. More opportunity, better schools. But you said theory. When these market ideas hit the real world, what does the research actually show? Does it always work out like that?
Rarely that simple. Choice mechanisms in practice, they're often complex, and they can lead to, complicated outcomes, sometimes even contradictory ones. You often see unintended consequences, things like actually increasing inequity or more stratification between schools, even ethnic segregation in some cases. It's a global issue. Absolutely. In developed countries, you've got things like school vouchers in the U.S. or charter schools, magnet schools, lots of variety there. The UK had its big 1988 Education Reform Act. That brought in open enrollment based on parental preference, supposedly getting rid of strict neighborhood school zones. And in developing countries, too. Chile, for instance, they've had a national voucher system since way back in 1982. The main point from looking globally is, like our source says, no one country has a monopoly on choice policy. Every system has its own rules, its own structure, but they often wrestle with very similar problems. So connecting it back, it's clear these choice systems aren't straightforward. The specific rules, the structures, they really shape the outcomes, whether you get more equity or, well, more disparity. And the T&T case, it's a really rich way to look at these global dynamics in action.
That's a perfect setup. Okay, let's zoom back into Trinidad and Tobago then. What did the study find about which schools families actually want most? Is there a clear pecking order? Any surprises?
Yes, the data is pretty clear on that. Looking at the first choice selections from their huge database, there's a really strong preference for what they call traditional schools. These are generally the older ones, built before the 1960s. Yeah. And they consistently dominate the top 10 lists for both boys and girls.
Okay, so give us an example. Like for boys, who's at the very top?
Well, Queen's Royal College QRC. It's a very prestigious government school for boys. That one was the most frequently picked first choice for males. A real household name.
Right. And the other top ones, were they mostly government schools too?
Actually, no. Most of the other top-ranked single-sex schools for boys were denominational, mainly Catholic, Presbyterian, and Anglican schools. And for girls, it was a similar picture. Traditional schools were dominant, although you do see some movement there. Lakshmi Girls Hindu College, for instance. It's a, well, relatively newer denominational school, but it has a very strong academic reputation for girls. And it was consistently in the top 10 for females in both time periods they studied. Shows that a newer school can build that kind of prestige.
So, okay, tradition is powerful, but you mentioned Lakshmi Girls. Did the study find other examples, sort of cracks in the market where newer schools managed to break into that elite group? And, what does that tell us about what parents are really looking for, beyond just the old name?
Absolutely. There was Bishop Anstey High School East, another relatively new denominational girls' school. It actually entered the top 10 rankings for females during the second period, 2001-2005. So that dynamism, it suggests that while tradition is sticky, quality can get recognized pretty quickly, even in a system that seems quite rigid. It suggests families are willing to look beyond just the historical reputation if a newer school proves itself.
The study really gets into those factors, right? Like looking at choices by the type of school management. Government schools were chosen most overall, sure. But you mentioned denominational schools. Catholic and Presbyterian especially saw a big jump in preference, particularly for girls.
That's right. Nearly 70% of families chose a denominational school for their daughter in that later period. It's a really significant figure.
So it's not just old versus new, but also government versus denominational.
Exactly. And the study also looked at the age of the schools chosen. Strong preference, as we said, for the older pre-1950 traditional schools. But while most still preferred those, some of the newer sector schools, these were the 5 to 7 year high schools built after 1991. They came about under this big national project, the SEMP School Education Modernization Project. And these newer SEMP schools were seen as, well, better quality than the earlier attempts at expansion, like the junior secondary or senior comprehensive schools from the 70s and 80s. Also, the length of schooling mattered. A 7-year program versus, say, less than 5 years. That was a big deal. Most families went for the 7-year schools.
Okay, and what about those extra choices? When they went from 4 to 6, did people actually use choices number 5 and 6?
That's one of the really interesting findings. For choices 5 and 6, the most common answer for both boys and girls was actually no choice. They just left it blank.
Really? So people didn't need them?
Well, it suggests that for many families, maybe their top 4 were enough. Or perhaps they just didn't see other desirable options available to them in their area for those lower slots. But, and this is important, the study also showed those lower choices were crucial for some people, especially in certain geographic areas, and particularly for female students. You saw specific schools, like the El Dorado schools, large government co-ed schools popping up frequently as 5th or 6th choices. So it raises that question, doesn't it? If families aren't using all the slots, does that mean they're happy with their top picks? Or does it point to a lack of perceived quality further down the list?
That's a really key distinction, yeah. It's not just what they choose, but what they don't choose and maybe why. Let's move beyond the numbers now. The study also looked at the human side, right? The motivations, the emotions involved.
Oh, definitely. The interviews, the qualitative data really brought some fascinating things to light. One concept the study talks about is circuits of schooling, like separate markets.
With circuits, like geographic bubbles.
Kind of. It means schools operate within these distinct spheres, often based on location. So some really high-demand schools, like St. Mary's College, that's a prestigious Catholic boys' school, or QRC, which we mentioned, they draw students from all over, multiple districts. But other schools have much more restricted local markets. They mostly pull from nearby. And interestingly, the boundaries of these circuits were different for boys and girls, suggesting gender plays a role in how far families are willing to let their kids travel.
That makes sense. And religion. Trinidad and Tobago is very diverse religiously. How did that play into the choices? Must be complex.
It certainly is very nuanced. This study found that non-mainstream denominations like Baptists, Orisha, Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, they were more likely to choose government schools. On the flip side, Presbyterians and Muslims were the most reluctant groups to choose government schools. And Presbyterians and Catholics, they were the most likely to choose schools run by their own denomination, especially Presbyterians choosing Presbyterian schools for their daughters.
Huh. Any other surprises there?
Well, maybe the Anglicans. They tended to favor government schools, even though they do have some high-achieving Anglican denominational schools available. So yeah, what's really fascinating is how all these factors, not just academics, weave together. Religion, geography, maybe family tradition. It's clearly not just a simple, rational economic calculation, is it?
Not at all. So with all this complexity, who's actually making the final call in the family? Is it purely the parents or the kids getting a say?
The interview showed really clearly that while parents are, yes, the primary decision makers, the children are definitely not just passive bystanders. They're active participants. They negotiate. Sometimes they even seem to have the dominant voice. There's this great quote from one student. Well, I had sitting in the exam, so I put my two choices first. Her mother put her two choices last, since she had to write the list.
Wow, talk about taking ownership.
Exactly. And the study also points out the crucial role of teachers giving advice. And extended family too, grandmothers, aunts, sisters often get involved. But it does seem like mothers are often the main ones kind of managing the whole process.
That's powerful. The kids feeling so invested. And I guess the emotional stakes must be sky high, especially given how people talk about the schools themselves.
You hit it right there. A really key insight is this idea of valorization and demonization. Families paint these incredibly vivid pictures of schools. They're either heroic or villainous. And that dramatically ramps up the emotional weight of the decision. Often demonizing certain schools, seeing them as, violent, unsafe, maybe morally corrupting. That was a huge factor in rejecting them. There's this heartbreaking quote from a student about a junior secondary school. I don't want to go DM because it'd have plenty real nastiness going on. I don't want to pass for a junior secondary school because I would get so much licks.
Oof. That just, that really brings home the fear and anxiety involved. These aren't abstract choices at all.
Not in the slightest. They're deeply personal hopes and, yes, fears.
So if these big decisions are driven by such strong emotions and maybe fear, are they based on solid information or more on reputation and hearsay?
It seems largely the latter. The decision-making is really fueled by these strong perceptions, by anecdotes passed through social networks, friends, family, neighbors. It's not typically based on, say, easily accessible official performance data for schools. And this lack of formal, comparable information, the study argues, actually helps maintain what they call the hegemony of the traditional schools. Reputation, built up over generations, holds enormous sway.
So what do families ultimately want? What's the ideal school in their eyes?
Well, summarizing from the interviews, they want a school that provides competence, academic, yes, but also emotional and social. Safety is huge, discipline, and, crucially, offering the right subjects for future careers. Parents describe balancing all these things: location, the school's reputation, discipline levels, even thinking about how siblings might influence each other at the same school.
It sounds incredibly personal, often informal, definitely emotional. And with all that, I bet there are feelings of unfairness sometimes, even if the system isn't meant to be unfair.
Absolutely. The study did pick up on anomalies, things in the placement process that made students and parents feel it was unfair. Sometimes they even suspected, graft or favoritism. Students in the focus groups told stories about friends who got really high exam scores but ended up in schools they didn't want at all, or even placed in a junior secondary when they expected a prestige school. Now, there might be official explanations for those placements, but the perception of unfairness was definitely real and very impactful for those families.
Okay, so we've got this system built on the idea of choice, a constitutional right even, but the reality seems to be, that for many, choice is more like a wish. That has some pretty big implications for equity, doesn't it?
Huge implications. The study's data on actual placement outcomes is, well, pretty stark. Despite having more schools available over time, in most parts of Trinidad, less than 20% of students actually got into their first choice school.
Less than 1 in 5. Wow.
Yeah, it's a major reality check for a system that champions parental choice.
Is that number consistent across the country? Or does it vary? And does socioeconomic background make a difference?
It varies a lot.
Yeah.
Tobago, for instance, smaller population, fewer schools. Nearly 50% got their first choice in the later period. Much higher.
Okay.
But in the really densely populated areas on Trinidad, like Port of Spain or the St. George East region, you see a high percentage of students being assigned a school directly by the Ministry of Education. Even with 6 choices on the tables, like 30% in Port of Spain, nearly 25% in St. George East, just got assigned somewhere by the MOE.
So their choices didn't count, effectively.
Effectively, yeah. And yes, socioeconomic status is definitely linked. The study used something called the Basic Needs Index, or BNI, to measure community wealth or deprivation. And it found a really sharp correlation. Communities identified as disadvantaged, like Beetham, for example, had incredibly low first-choice success rates, like 4% to 6%, and consequently, very high rates of being assigned a school by the MOE. Compare that to less deprived areas, like Victoria Gardens. Their first-choice rates were much, much higher, ranging from about 33% up to over 70% in some years.
That really lays the inequity bare, doesn't it? The system works very differently depending on where you live and presumably your family's resources.
It starkly highlights that, yes. A significant equity issue seems embedded right within the choice mechanism itself.
So this whole deep dive really paints a picture of, well, a complex mix. History, policy, human feelings, practical realities. It's clear that just having a right to choose doesn't automatically mean equal opportunity for everyone. What other sort of nuances did the study pull out?
Well, one thing we touched on is how decisions often play out differently for boys versus girls. Like families being perhaps more willing to let boys travel further for school than girls. It just suggests that gender is really woven into the whole process, influencing how families weigh the risks and benefits for their child.
Right. And thinking about those newer schools, the ones trying to compete with the traditional giants, what's the takeaway for them?
The study basically suggests they need to market themselves more effectively, be more proactive. The example of Bishop Anstey High School East shows the market can recognize quality relatively quickly. So if these newer schools, government or denominational, can consistently deliver quality and communicate that effectively, they can potentially shift perceptions and break into that more desired circuit of schools.
Okay. And you mentioned earlier the ministry tried to cut the choices back from 6 to 4, but got pushback. Based on what the study found, was reducing choices actually a good idea?
Well, the study argues pretty strongly that those 5th and 6th choices were actually critical for some families, especially in those districts where getting placed was really tough, and particularly for girls. Those extra slots acted as a kind of crucial safety net if the top choices didn't work out. So the study implies the MOE should probably think carefully about the fairness of cutting choices like that, especially without really solid data showing it wouldn't hurt specific groups or areas. It could just narrow the real choice even further for some.
So that keeps coming back to this paradox. Choice is enshrined, policies aim for access, but the system still generates these big disparities.
It absolutely does, and that's really the bottom line of the study's conclusion. School choice, on its own, just can't fix those deep-seated gaps in achievement between students, or the fundamental differences in quality between schools. The current system, even with the right to choose, often ends up in a situation where, as they put it, both students and schools may be losing. For many families, it makes that choice feel more like a lottery ticket, a wish, rather than a real guarantee of opportunity.
Which brings us to our final thought for you, the listener. Considering this deep dive, if choice, even when it's a constitutional right, doesn't automatically create real opportunity for every single child, then what fundamental shifts, maybe things beyond just offering more options on a form, are truly needed to create genuinely equitable access to quality education?
That really is the core question, isn't it? It pushes us to look past just the mechanics of choosing and maybe deeper into the quality and resourcing of all the schools within the system.
It definitely does. Wow, we've gone from the history books of Trinidad and Tobago right into the kitchens where families make these tough choices and then face the hard numbers of who gets what. It's a powerful look at the promise and the paradox of educational choice.
And we really hope this deep dive gets you thinking about how these kinds of dynamics might play out in education systems you know. What does choice truly mean in practice? And who does it really serve?
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.